The studio lights blazed overhead as the red light on camera 3 flicked on. Live in 3, 2, 1. Across millions of living rooms, the screen lit up with the high-energy branding of Capitol Forum Tonight, one of the most watched primetime political shows in the country. The host, veteran anchor Melissa Trenholm, leaned forward with her signature practice smile, her notes perfectly stacked beside her coffee mug. But tonight was different. Her guest was Senator J.D. Vance, former Marine, best-selling author and rising political figure whose passionate speeches about forgotten veterans had begun gaining traction beyond party lines. Senator Vance, Melissa began with a chuckle, you've recently made headlines with your push for what you're calling the Soldier's Dignity Act, and I have to ask. She glanced down at her cards, then looked up with a grin that didn't hide its cynicism. You really believe more taxpayer money should go to so-called veterans who, in many cases, already get generous benefits? You're not worried you're just playing politics with patriotic buzzwords? J.D. didn't blink. He just looked at her, calm, still. Melissa laughed again, this time louder. Come on, Senator. You're not seriously claiming that our veterans are neglected in America? Not in 2025. There it was, the laugh, soft, dismissive, almost amused. The internet wouldn't catch it yet, but the control room had frozen. The executive producer raised an eyebrow. The teleprompter paused. Something had shifted. J.D.'s silence wasn't just measured, it was gathering. Then he leaned forward slightly, elbows on the desk, and looked straight into the camera, not at her. What I'm about to say, he said, voice low and even, isn't for you, Melissa. He paused. It's for the veteran sitting alone right now, wondering if anyone in Washington still remembers his name, or if he's just a statistic on a spreadsheet. Silence. Melissa blinked. Because if you think this is about buzzwords, then you've never stood beside a man with a prosthetic leg he had to crowdfund. You've never looked a mother in the eye who sold her house to pay for her son's PTSD treatment, because the VA had a 9-month backlog. You've never buried a Marine who died from suicide, not shrapnel, after being told he was fit to wait. The laughter was gone now. In the control room, no one breathed. And across the country, veterans and families who had long felt invisible suddenly sat up. He wasn't finished. He turned back to Melissa, voice still composed, but eyes hard. So yes, J.D. said, I support our veterans, and if that makes you laugh, maybe the punchline's on you. Melissa Trenholm didn't speak. She glanced down at her cue cards, then back up, but the playful smirk that opened the segment was gone. She hadn't expected J.D. Vance to come with fire behind the calm. She hadn't expected him to look directly into the homes of millions and speak in a tone that felt like confession, not politics. The silence lingered just a few beats too long. Then, in a studio where every second was scheduled, J.D. spoke again, this time quieter. I remember a guy named Staff Sergeant Tom Daniels, he said, eyes fixed forward. 2 tours in Iraq, 3 in Afghanistan, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, came home with shrapnel in his back and trauma in his brain. Couldn't get a consistent therapist, moved from town to town looking for work. One night he sent me a voicemail. J.D.'s voice broke slightly. He said, Vance, I feel like I survived the war but died in the peace. The next day his sister found him in the garage. Melissa blinked hard. In the control room, the segment timer was already flashing red. The producer motioned to cut, go to break, but no one moved. J.D. leaned forward again, this time toward her. You laughed, and you're not the only one. This town, this industry, this city of optics, they all laugh. But every time someone laughs, a veteran loses hope. And you tell me, how many more of them have to suffer silently before people like you stop giggling at the idea of fighting for them? The live comments on social media began exploding. Words like powerful, speechless, finally someone said it, scrolled like wildfire. Melissa tried to recover. Senator, I didn't mean to minimize the sacrifices. You don't have to mean it, J.D. interrupted. It's in the reflex. You hear veteran funding and you flinch. You hear combat trauma and you change the topic. You laugh because if you didn't, maybe you'd have to ask why we let them suffer in the first place. He turned back to the camera again. This isn't about left or right. This is about whether a nation that sends its sons and daughters to war has the spine to stand by them when they come home broken. He looked back at Melissa. And whether our media still has the courage to listen when the truth hurts. By the time the segment ended, Twitter was on fire. Clips of JD's voice, calm, steady, heartbreaking, spread like wildfire. Influencers from all sides of the political aisle reposted it. Veterans groups flooded the comments. Hashtags like Hack Soldiers Dignity Now, JD was right and Stop Laughing, Start Listening began trending within minutes. But the moment that sparked even more attention? Melissa's silence. The nation had watched her laugh, just briefly, casually, as if she were swatting away a tired political trope. And then they watched her freeze, caught in a tidal wave she didn't see coming. In the hallway outside the studio, a low-ranking intern named Kamira scrolled her phone, mouth slightly open. She was a Navy brat. Her father had served 20 years. She'd watched that same laugh 1,000 times from people who didn't get it. But tonight, something had shifted. Inside the editing bay, the team watched the footage again. Melissa's laugh, JD's stare. Then the moment he said, "You don't have to mean it. It's in the reflex." One of the assistant producers stood and walked out, quietly saying, "I'm calling my brother. He served in Fallujah. I haven't talked to him in months." Meanwhile, Melissa Trenholm sat in her dressing room, staring into the mirror. The lights were still on, her makeup perfect, her notes untouched, and her hand was shaking. She had interviewed presidents. She had moderated debates. She had grilled candidates with a half smile for over 2 decades. But tonight, somewhere between JD's words and the silence that followed, something had slipped through. Her defenses. She reached for her phone and saw the flood of messages, both praise and criticism. Some were brutal. You laughed in the face of trauma, shame. This is why vets don't speak up. JD Vance didn't destroy you. He revealed you. But then came the others. Thank you for letting him speak. That silence was more honest than any apology. You looked like you heard him. Melissa had never cried after a segment, not once. But tonight her mascara began to run. The network brass wanted a statement. They always did when things went viral, for the wrong reasons. Melissa Trenholm, still in her blazer and studio heels, sat quietly in the glass-walled conference room as her executive producer paced the floor. Behind him, monitors showed replays of the now infamous moment. News aggregators had already picked it up. Headlines blared, JD Vance silences reporter with veteran truth bomb. Senator's speech sparks national debate over veteran care. Did Melissa Trenholm cross a line? But that wasn't what haunted her. It was his voice. The voice of a man who didn't blink, who didn't shout, who didn't spin, just told the truth. And somewhere between the name Staff Sergeant Tom Daniels and the phrase "died in the peace," something inside her broke. She didn't grow up military. She didn't understand what it meant to be handed a folded flag. She covered those stories with cold distance, never once asking herself if it should feel like more. But now she saw his sister's eyes in her imagination. The garage door, the voicemail, her producer's voice cut through the fog. "Melissa, you need to post something, a tweet, a statement, just acknowledge it." She nodded, then stood. "I'll write it myself." He blinked. "You sure?" She didn't answer, just walked down the corridor, heels echoing in the empty hallway. Back in her office, she opened her laptop, but didn't write yet. She just stared at the blank screen, then reached into her bag and pulled out an old photo. A man in uniform. She hadn't seen it in years. Her uncle, Sergeant Ben Hurley, died in 2009, Afghanistan. The funeral was closed casket. Her mother had cried in the church pew, and Melissa, just a local news anchor at the time, had told herself to stay strong, professional, unaffected. She'd forgotten. She never even told her audience she had a relative who served. JD Vance hadn't just reminded her. He'd held a mirror up to a nation of journalists who had stopped listening and started laughing. And tonight, one of them couldn't laugh anymore. By morning, it wasn't just a trending clip. It was a movement. Veterans across the country began posting under the hashtag "died in the peace," a phrase born from JD Vance's haunting words. Some shared pictures, some shared names. Others just wrote a line. "JD spoke for me. I never thought anyone would." Melissa Trenholm hadn't slept. She sat in her kitchen, staring at her phone as the view count passed 41 million. She'd typed a dozen apology tweets, deleted them all. Words weren't enough. She needed to understand. So she called someone she hadn't spoken to in years, Shannon Hurley, her cousin, Sergeant Ben Hurley's daughter. It rang, then clicked. "Melissa?" "Shannon. Hey, it's been a while." Pause. "Yeah, I saw the clip." Melissa inhaled slowly. I deserved it. I laughed. I didn't mean to, but I did. And J.D. Vance, he didn't just correct me, he exposed me. Another pause. Then Shannon said quietly, I didn't need an apology. I just needed someone to listen to what they go through. That's what J.D. did. Melissa's throat tightened. Later that afternoon, J.D. Vance released a letter, public handwritten, posted on his official site. It read in part, To every veteran who ever felt like this country forgot you, I heard you long before last night. But last night, America heard you too. This isn't about me. It's about making sure no politician, reporter, or citizen ever laughs at your pain again. You didn't serve the country. You built it, and we will not leave you behind. J.D. Vance. The post was shared over 100,000 times in the first hour. Melissa read the letter 3 times in a row, not for content, but for something deeper. Then she made a decision. That night, Capitol Forum Tonight opened not with its usual montage of headlines, nor with polished music or a witty monologue. Instead, the screen cut cold to Melissa Trenholm. No makeup team, no blazer, just a black blouse. No cue cards. A single camera. A quiet set. I've been doing this show for 17 years, she began, voice a little lower than usual, and I've made a career of asking tough questions, some necessary, some performative. Last night I asked one that revealed more about me than my guest. A pause. I laughed. Not at our veterans, not at their pain, but at the idea of someone in power doing something radical for them. That laugh, that reflex, wasn't just tone-deaf. It was born of ignorance. She looked down, then back up, and this time her voice cracked. My uncle, Ben Hurley, died in 2009, U.S. Army. I never mentioned him on this show, not once, because I thought being objective meant being untouched, unfeeling. A silence washed over the airwaves. But J.D. Vance didn't speak like a politician. He spoke like a man who's walked beside the broken, who's carried stories he can't put down, and I laughed. She looked directly into the camera. So today, I won't hide behind a press release or a tweet. I want to say this, I'm sorry. And I want to do something that doesn't erase last night, but honors what it uncovered. She reached under the desk and lifted a folder. This is my next show. It's not about polls. It's not about elections. It's about veterans, real stories from real people. We'll air them all week. No music, no applause, just a quiet screen. In homes across America, something began to change. Viewers didn't just repost the clip, they reflected on it. One young woman tweeted, I'm not a J.D. Vance fan, but what he did and how Melissa responded. That's what grown-ups look like. And in a small town in Indiana, a VM vet named Hank finally opened the journal he'd kept hidden for decades and called the number listed in the episode's credits. The next day, J.D. Vance wasn't in D.C., he was in Dayton, Ohio, standing in the back of a modest VFW hall where the paint peeled near the floorboards and the coffee was always fresh. The crowd wasn't large, maybe 40 chairs, half full, but the room was sacred ground. Some sat with oxygen tanks, some walked with canes. All of them had one thing in common. They were the men and women he had spoken for. When J.D. stepped up to the mic, no fanfare greeted him. No chants, just nods. I didn't come here to campaign, he said. I came here to listen. He paused, looked around. I've been a Marine. I've seen the cost. But the last few days, I saw something else. I saw that we're not just losing lives on the battlefield. We're losing them in the silence that follows. He gestured toward a small table in the back where folded flags rested beneath framed portraits. That silence ends here. Afterward, people approached one by one. They didn't ask for photos. They handed him letters, names, journals, dog tags. Then, as he prepared to leave, a woman in her early 30s approached quietly. Jeans, windbreaker, no press badge. Senator Vance? She asked. He turned. I'm Shannon Hurley. He blinked. Melissa's cousin. She nodded. She told me what you said and what it meant. From her coat, she pulled a small item, a black and white photo of a man in uniform. My dad, Sergeant Ben Hurley. He used to say there were 2 kinds of people, those who talk about honor and those who carry it like a burden. She looked J.D. in the eye. You carried it. J.D. held the photo gently, reverently. I didn't serve with him, he said, but I'll serve for him. Shannon's voice wavered. Thank you for giving voice to all of us who lost them after they came home. He nodded, and in that quiet Ohio hall, no cameras rolled, no tweets were drafted, but something holy passed between them, an unspoken vow, and the rest of the nation kept watching. Back in Washington, the mood had changed. Congressional inboxes were flooded. Veteran advocacy groups weren't just cheering J.D. Vance, they were demanding that the entire chamber act. A petition titled "Honor the Peace, Real Care for Our Veterans" had gained over 2 million signatures in 3 days. And at the heart of it was one phrase: he survived the war, but died in the peace. Senator Vance walked the marbled halls of the Capitol, a folder in hand. Inside it, the draft of a new bipartisan resolution, the Hurley-Daniels Veterans Dignity Act, named for 2 soldiers the country never truly honored until their stories were spoken aloud. It called for full mental health screenings for veterans within 30 days of return, expanded access to private PTSD treatment, guaranteed housing for honorably discharged veterans, a national hotline managed by veterans, not bureaucrats. But more than that, it required that all federally funded media broadcasts about military service include a segment spotlighting veteran stories, real ones, from the people who lived them. And then the unexpected happened. Melissa Trenholm, once the face of viral ridicule, walked into JD's office unannounced. "I want to help," she said plainly. He raised an eyebrow. "You already did," he replied, setting the folder on the table, "by being willing to change." She nodded slowly. "No, that was just a start. I want this to be more than headlines. I want to make it harder for people like me to ever laugh again." JD handed her the draft. "Then read this, and tell your viewers why it matters." That night on Capitol Forum Tonight, Melissa looked directly into the camera and said, "I've read the Hurley-Daniels Act. It isn't perfect, but it's real, and it's a start. We cannot undo the laughter, but we can replace it with action." And in veteran halls across the country, televisions stayed on just a little longer. C-SPAN didn't usually go viral, but on Thursday morning, the network's feed was clipped and shared within minutes of J.D. Vance rising from his chair in the Senate chamber, clutching the final draft of the Hurley-Daniels Veterans Dignity Act. He walked slowly to the lectern, adjusted the mic and began. "I wasn't supposed to speak today." He looked around at the half-full chamber, then up toward the gallery, where veterans sat in neat rows, some in wheelchairs, others with chests full of ribbons no one had asked about in years. "I served my country, but I don't speak for every veteran. I speak for the ones no one listened to, the ones who didn't die on the battlefield, but never really made it home." He opened the folder. "We name this bill after 2 of them, Sergeant Ben Hurley and Staff Sergeant Tom Daniels. Their names won't be found in textbooks, their memorials won't be carved in granite, but their stories changed something. And we are gathered here not because a lawmaker spoke, but because a reporter laughed." The room grew still, and then she listened. JD looked up to the press balcony. Melissa sat silently, her hands folded tightly in her lap. It would have been easy to double down, to pivot, to protect the brand. But she chose something harder. She chose humility, and that humility lit the fire under this bill. He held it high. "This is not about blame. It's about becoming worthy of the people who gave more than we ever asked for. So today, I ask not for votes, but for courage, the kind that shows up after the fighting ends." The chamber erupted in applause, not performative but heavy, grounded. Several senators wiped their eyes. Outside the Capitol, hundreds had gathered. Flags waved. Families held framed photos. One woman clutched dog tags in both hands and whispered, "He was never forgotten. Not really." Later that evening, Melissa aired the speech in full. No commentary, no interruption. Just the sound of a country for once getting it right. 1 week later, the bill passed. Not with controversy, not with party-line debates. It passed unanimously. The Hurley-Daniels Veterans Dignity Act was now law, and for the first time in decades, veterans were watching C-SPAN and clapping. In a quiet ceremony on the Capitol lawn, J.D. Vance stood beside Shannon Hurley, holding the original draft of the bill in a leather case. He didn't speak long, just enough. "This paper is a promise," he said, "to the living and to the ones who died long after the war ended." When he handed the framed version to Shannon, she didn't cry. She saluted. The crowd, mostly veterans and Gold Star families, stood in complete silence. Not even birdsong dared interrupt. Then, later that evening, Melissa Trenholm aired her final segment on the matter. It opened with an old photo, her Uncle Ben in uniform, laughing beside a Jeep. Then it cut to Melissa, live in studio. "I've been in media for over 2 decades. I've had the honor of sitting across from presidents, generals, and candidates, but no moment in my career has shaped me more than the night I laughed, and a Marine reminded me why I shouldn't have. She inhaled sharply. We do not become better by pretending we're right. We become better by confronting when we're wrong. She looked down, then lifted a small box and opened it. Inside, a folded flag. This was my uncle's. For years it stayed in a drawer. After this week, I'm placing it in my newsroom, where it belongs. The broadcast ended not with outro music or graphics, but with 20 seconds of silence, a black screen, and 5 words in white text: "We hear you now, always." And somewhere, on a front porch in Kansas, or in a hospital in Tennessee, or a living room in Queens, a veteran sat forward, remote in hand, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, seen, not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as a human being worth fighting for.